We hear so many promises during political campaigns, right? And it always makes me wonder, how often do those promises actually become reality once a leader takes office?
It's a great question. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of all those big speeches and grand pronouncements, but what really matters in the end are the actual actions a leader takes, right? Not just the words.
Exactly. And what happens when there's a gap, between all that campaign talk and the real world actions? What are the consequences? That's what we're diving into today.
It's such a crucial question, especially when we think about long-term consequences, both domestically and globally.
Absolutely. So to get a handle on this, we're looking at a piece called Pasted Text, and it's set in the year 2030. Picture this.
Yeah.
It's a conversation between a guy named David Lipton and his granddaughter, Alicia.
Okay.
And they're on Long Island looking out at Chinese ships and reflecting on how their nation, the USA, got to that point.
That's an interesting way to frame it, looking back from the future to understand the choices that led them there.
Exactly. It's kind of like a thought experiment, forcing us to confront the potential ripple effects of those choices.
Makes you think about the cause and effect of decisions made today, right?
Precisely.
Sure.
So our mission in this deep dive is to take those reflections from the future and connect them to some major moments in U.S. history. We're going to look at specific cases where a president's actions maybe diverged from what they said during the campaign.
And we'll see what impact those actions had, right? Both at home and on the world stage.
Exactly. And it's not about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's more about understanding that complex shift that happens when someone goes from campaigning to actually running the country.
Right. It's a huge transition, going from campaigner to actually being the one making those tough decisions.
The one pushing the button, as the text puts it. So let's dig into this idea of the campaigner becomes the button pusher. What really changes in that transition?
Well, the text makes a really interesting point. It says during the campaign, it's all about words, right? Promises, speeches, grand visions of the future. That's the currency of the campaign. And there isn't always a price to pay for being inconsistent or even contradicting yourself.
Right. It's all about winning over voters with language and ideas. But the moment you're sworn in,
Everything shifts.
exactly, it's no longer just about words. It's about the policies you enact, the decisions you make, the actual things you do. That's what matters to other world leaders, to the economy, to the future of the country. Words don't mean much if they're not backed up by actions.
Yeah, foreign leaders aren't impressed by catchy slogans. They care about what you actually do, how you behave on the world stage.
And the text makes a really smart observation here. It says that during the campaign, confusing words with deeds doesn't have any immediate consequences. But,
You're in power.
yeah, once you're in power, the lack of consistent action, that's what has serious lasting consequences. It can damage trust, create uncertainty, and even undermine the nation's strategic goals.
It's like you said, words without actions are empty.
And this is where the questions that Alicia, the granddaughter in the story, asks her grandfather become really important. They highlight the things we need to explore. She asks things like, why did the USA abandon certain policies like containment? Why didn't military force always work? Why was support for allies sometimes inconsistent? Why were economic policies sometimes changed so suddenly?
And did leaders always act with, a consistent level of seriousness and commitment? These are big questions.
They really are. And they force us to look beyond the surface and ask whether there's a pattern of inconsistency in U.S. actions and what the long-term effects of that might be.
These aren't just theoretical questions either. They give us a way to analyze specific periods in American history and really understand the decisions that were made.
Right. And the author of Pasted Text, writing from this future perspective, he expresses this concern about how younger generations seem to lack historical knowledge. He talks about being surrounded by a ton of information online, but without the historical context to really make sense of it.
That's so true. It's like having all the puzzle pieces but not knowing how they fit together.
Exactly. And this deep dive, in a way, it's our attempt to give you, our listener, some of that historical context so you can understand these patterns of consistency and inconsistency in leadership.
Because if we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it, right?
Absolutely. All right, so let's jump into some concrete historical examples that the text brings up, either directly or indirectly. A great place to start is with President Woodrow Wilson after World War I.
Yeah, Wilson's 14-point speech in 1918, that was a really big deal.
It was a huge moment.
He laid out this incredibly idealistic vision for the post-war world. Things like self-determination for nations, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars.
Yeah, it set the bar really high for America's role in shaping the world.
It was powerful rhetoric, promising a war to end all wars and a future built on cooperation, really resonated with people.
But then, when it came time to turn those ideals into reality,
There was a disconnect.
big time. The U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and refused to join the League of Nations, which was Wilson's big idea. So you have this massive gap between the president's vision and the actions of the U.S. government.
And it shows that even when a president has a strong vision and lays it out eloquently, it can be undermined if there isn't enough support at home.
Yeah, you need more than just presidential will. You need that domestic political backing to make things happen on the world stage.
It's interesting, too, because it wasn't just about how other countries reacted. It was a contradiction within the U.S. government itself. The president pushing for this new global order, and then part of Congress saying, nope, we're not on board.
And that sends a mixed message to the world.
Definitely. Like, how committed are you really? The war to end all wars, sadly, didn't live up to its name. And without the U.S., the League of Nations was significantly weakened.
So it's an early but crucial example of how pronouncements on the world stage don't always translate into action at home. And that failure to live up to those big goals, it had a lasting impact. Now, let's look at a contrasting example, a period where consistent action arguably led to success.
You mean the Cold War?
Yeah, the Cold War and the policy of containment.
Which the text actually calls an unqualified success. And when you look back, it's hard to disagree.
It really is. Because from Truman to Reagan, the basic strategy of containing Soviet expansion stayed pretty consistent across multiple administrations.
Right. And it wasn't just about talk. It was decades of concrete action. NATO, the Marshall Plan, a sustained effort to counter Soviet influence around the world.
It's a great example of what happens when the U.S. has a clear strategic interest, in this case, preventing the spread of communism, and then backs it up with consistent long-term action.
For decades. And it really shows that when America walks the talk over time, it can shape global events in a huge way.
Now, let's shift gears and talk about two examples that the text, at least implicitly, suggests were less successful.
Vietnam and Afghanistan.
You got it. These can be seen as cases of long-term engagement followed by eventual withdrawal, which raises questions about consistency in strategy and commitment.
In both cases, the U.S. got involved with specific objectives in mind. But the long-term strategies, and crucially the sustained commitment to those strategies, they kind of fluctuated, you know?
Yeah, they definitely evolved over time.
Especially with so many different presidents involved. Like in Vietnam, you had the escalation under Kennedy and Johnson, then Nixon's Vietnamization, and finally the withdrawal under Ford.
And in Afghanistan, it was similar. The initial intervention with Bush, the surge under Obama, and then the withdrawal under Biden. It's almost like these long wars became, well...
A kind of political football.
Yeah, exactly. Tossed back and forth between administrations. And it raises the question, how do you maintain a clear, consistent strategy in a conflict that spans decades and multiple presidencies?
And especially when the goals themselves might be evolving or even unclear.
It's a tough question. And in both cases, the ultimate withdrawal raised questions about whether those initial objectives were ever truly achieved.
It also makes you wonder, was there ever a truly unwavering commitment to those objectives? Were the resources and strategies really aligned with achieving them over the long haul?
Yeah, because the shifts in approach and the eventual withdrawals, they kind of point to a lack of that sustained, consistent action we saw in the Cold War.
And it's sobering to think about the human and strategic costs associated with those inconsistencies.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move on to the fourth example, which is particularly interesting because it's presented from that future perspective.
Yeah.
Looking back at the period from 2024 to 2028 under President Donald Trump.
And the text calls this a time of abrupt policy reversals.
Right. It paints a picture of American foreign policy becoming much less predictable.
It talks about tariffs being imposed somewhat randomly, not just on rivals, but also on allies. And there's this loosening of ties with NATO and Western Europe and these seemingly unpredictable actions in the Middle East.
And perhaps the most significant point is that during this period, according to the text, the U.S. was unwilling and unable to respond to China's actions regarding Taiwan.
Wow. So in this future scenario, the U.S. comes across as inconsistent and unreliable, even when its core strategic interests are at stake.
It raises concerns about whether those actions might have actually damaged America's standing in the world and emboldened adversaries.
It definitely makes you think about the potential downsides of sudden and unpredictable shifts in policy.
So looking back across all four of these examples, Wilson after World War I, the Cold War containment policy, the wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and this future portrayal of a Trump presidency, the author of Pasted Text, sees what they call a striking century-long pattern of inconsistent behavior in U.S. foreign policy.
And they argue that this inconsistency stems from the U.S. abandoning what they call a hard-headed calculation of its long-term strategic interests, specifically the interest of keeping adversaries out of the Western Hemisphere.
So they're connecting these seemingly different historical moments into a larger narrative about a persistent failure to act in a way that consistently protects those fundamental long-term interests.
And the implication is that this inconsistency has real consequences.
Big time. Because the author, writing from this future perspective of 2030, says they're now living the consequences of our greatly reduced nation as a direct result of those past inconsistencies. It's a sobering thought.
It really drives home the point that the choices leaders make or don't make have a lasting impact, not just on their own time in office, but on the future of the nation.
But there's a glimmer of hope. Right. Because the author also reminds us that we still have the power to choose our own future.
By changing our actions.
Exactly. So while the text paints this pretty bleak picture of the future, it's also a call to action. It's saying that we can learn from these historical patterns and strive for more consistent, strategic action in the future.
Because the future isn't set in stone.
So to wrap things up, I think the key takeaway here is that there's a huge difference between the inspiring words we hear during campaigns and the real-world impact of a nation's actions on the global stage.
The choices made in the Oval Office have consequences that ripple far beyond the present moment.
Exactly. And as our historical examples show, both those from the past and that glimpse into the future, consistent action that's aligned with clear strategic interests, that's what leads to positive, long-term results.
So it's not just about what you say, it's about what you do and how consistently you do it.
Absolutely. And here's a final thought to leave you with. Looking at these examples, what are some signs we can look for today to tell if current political promises are likely to translate into consistent action in the future? What are the clues that a leader and their team are truly committed to walking the talk? Or conversely, what might suggest that there's a gap between the rhetoric and the reality?
It's about looking beyond the surface, right? Beyond the slogans and sound bites.
Exactly. Examine the strategies being proposed, the level of commitment to those strategies, and the overall consistency of approach over time.
Because actions speak louder than words. Always.
If you're interested in learning more about Pasted Text, you can find The Reckoning July 4, 2030 on Amazon.com. And keep an eye on our YouTube channel for an upcoming AI-generated conversation that takes a deeper dive into this fascinating shift from campaigner to button pusher.
It's going to be a good one.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.